Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. The capture of Victor Ramos left a power vacuum in the Miners and Steamfitters Union, and among Arcanist agents. As the new head of the Union, Tony Ironsides is struggling to hold the organization together, while Karis is leading an all-out rebellion against the Guild. That means individual members are having to decide where their loyalties lie. I hope you enjoy Lines in the Sand.
Lines in the Sand by Mike Wallace. The Ashpan, an average-looking bar with average-looking patrons, sat on the edge of the industrial zone. It was the kind of hole-in-the-wall that most people would glance at and forget 2 minutes later. John Case stood a few feet from the doorway, enjoying the creeping morning sunlight on his back. Even this early in the day, he saw huddled figures sipping hot tea through the windows, warming up before they set out for a long day in the factories that dominated the district. John was too early for the barkeep's soup of the day, and for that he was thankful. On good days, the barkeep would add fish or salted pork to his soup, but on bad days, well, nobody knew exactly what the meat was on a bad day. Case admonished himself for stalling. He glanced down at the pocket watch in his hand, an heirloom of his grandfather, and the faded photograph of his wife and their 2 children tucked into the watch's lid. His thumb brushed over them briefly before he snapped the watch shut and tucked it away. He entered the building and crossed the room to the bar, where Jonesy, the egg-shaped barkeep, stood cleaning a row of glasses. "Hey, Case!" The barkeep grinned as he recognized Case's face. "A while it's been." "Hey, Jonesy." Case replied. "I took some time to let the air clear, but now I'm back. Have any of the usual on tap?" Jonesy met his eyes for a moment, then slid a mug across the bar top. "You know where to find it." Case took the glass, slowly removed his hat, and placed it in a prominent position at the end of the bar. Then he stepped to the side and slipped through a beaten wooden door. He followed the staircase down into a small cellar, made all the more compact by the rows of ale kegs lining most of the walls. He stopped in front of one of the kegs and poured himself a mug from the tap. Despite the early hour, he slowly but steadily drank the brew down, savouring every sip like it was his last. When he was done, he wiped his lips and carefully set the mug on top of the keg. Then he reached behind it and pressed down on a small stone in the wall behind it. A bare section of wall, all brick and mortar, clicked quietly in the distance. He glanced over his shoulder and then cautiously approached the section of wall that had made the noise. There he pushed down on a more brown than red brick, and while keeping pressure there, pushed a second, broken red brick that sunk into the wall with a mechanical click. Gears grinded together behind the wall, and then it swung open, revealing a lightless hallway. Case stepped in and waited as the secret door closed shut behind him. Case resisted the urge to find his way forward by way of his hands, knowing full well the gauntlet of engineered traps waiting for him in the walls. Shock panels, dart plates, and more all threatened anyone with curious hands. He walked a straight line, thumbs in his belt, trusting his ability to walk a straight line in the near darkness. As his eyes adjusted, he gradually made out the outline of a door as the weak light from the other side peeked through. When he was close enough to knock, a spy hole slid open and the silhouette of a head filled it. "Wasn't expecting no visitors, who's there?" a gruff voice asked. "John Case." The figure grumbled and slammed the spy hole shut. John heard the metallic clicks of locks being disengaged, and then the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was another basement, probably belonging to one of the neighbouring buildings. The normal exit had been sealed and bricked up, leaving a stairwell that went nowhere. There were no windows, and the air was stale and hot. The far wall was dominated by a shelf, covered with all manner of supplies, bullets, guns, blades, medicines and bandages, maps of Malifaux, and dismantled bombs waiting for reassembling. The only other furnishing in the room was a long table with mismatched chairs. The table had been worn down over the years and was marked with knife gouges and burns. A few melted candles sat in the center, but an electric lantern hung from the ceiling and provided the room's illumination. 4 men and women stood and waited for Case at that table, all of them watching him carefully. Breaker, the gruff man who answered the door, put his hand, a pneumatic replacement that was shaped more like a claw than a human hand, on Case's shoulder, as if to welcome him back. "Where have you been hiding?" John knew all too well that the claw was capable of crushing his collarbone at a moment's notice if its owner thought it prudent. "Lying low," he answered, his gaze sweeping out across the people seated at the table. A dark-skinned woman with wiry hair, pulled back behind her head, stood up and put her hands on her hips. "Well, this is an unexpected surprise." Case nodded. "I heard that there was a job, so here I am." "Maybe." The woman responded, still suspicious. "Doppelganger protocols. You know the routine." "Right." Case sighed and pointed at her. "You're smoky." Then he went down the table, pointing at each of them as he spoke their names. "Savage," he said to the Asian woman at the opposite end of the table. "Rubens," he named the scowling, red-haired Irishman. "Breaker," he finished, nodding to the man whose pneumatic arm still gripped his shoulder. Everyone visibly relaxed, except maybe Rubens. Breaker released his shoulder and pulled Case into a bear hug, and Case tolerated the rib-crushing strength of it without complaint. "It's good to see you," Breaker said, his gruff voice taking on an almost childlike quality. "Your voice sure sounds different behind that door. When we heard you got pinched, I almost rushed out there to burn down the courthouse myself." "I'm glad that you avoided the patrols," Case mumbled, barely managing to keep his feet, as Breaker clapped him on the back. All right, let him breathe," Smokey said. "Sit down, Case, we got a lot to talk about." "Like if you sold us out," Rubens muttered. Case clenched his teeth, but didn't let it show. "Me. The last I saw of you was your backside as the guild kicked in the door." Rubens's scowl deepened. "You got something to say? You ran pretty fast for someone who brags about how many redcoats he's killed. Or maybe you knew they were coming." Rubens sat up in his chair, and his hand drifted towards the pistol in his belt. "You son of a—" Breaker waved his claw hand in Rubens's direction. "Easy, son." "Settle down," Smokey interrupted. "Settle down. No one's calling anyone the T-word." After a moment of strained silence, Rubens sat back down and leaned back in his chair, one foot on the table's edge. He stared at Case in distrust, but decided against voicing his suspicions. Case sat down beside Smokey, while keeping his eyes on the Irishman. "A lot has happened in the past 2 years," Smokey explained. "The death of the Governor-General, the raids and arrests, Caris and Ironsides taking over when Ramos stepped down, this Marlowe guy. We'll go over it all, but old business first, Case. We haven't seen you in a year. That's more than long enough to consider any member of this cell either compromised or dead. Here's your chance to plead your case, one way or another." Case took in a slow breath. "Well, you already knew about the boomer job Rubens and I did near Carter's Textiles. The usual sort of operation to burn down a place that does too much business with the guild. The job was textbook, but when we got to the safe house, it all went south." He glared at Rubens. "One minute I'm cleaning my pistol, and the next the guild is breaking down the door. Some of us were already halfway out the window before the first knock." "Up yours," Rubens snapped. "I was smoking near their window. The moment I saw them, I did the only smart thing to do." "Like you've ever done anything smart in your life," Case growled. "Enough," Smoky interjected. Go on, Case. Stick to the relevant points. The guild snatched us up. Case continued. Me and a dozen of other union men in the tavern. They packed us all into wagons and put us in those holding pens outside the courthouse. Word was they blamed us for the Governor-General's death, which is untrue. He cast a questioning glance towards Smoky. Smoky shook her head. I've been in touch with some of the higher-ups. They're as in the dark as anyone about what happened that night. Case sighed. Well, the guild seemed to realise that too. I spent a few weeks eating hard tack and waiting for my turn with Jack Daw before the new Governor-General showed up and pardoned the lot of us. They got me at the end of that mess. Savage spoke up. Only had me for a day. Which brings us to the second point, Smoky added. They only had me for 2 days before the pardons came down, though. She leaned forward over the table. After you got let out, though, why didn't you try to contact us? Why wait a whole year? Case sighed and then shrugged. I figured it was a bait and hook. Let the suspected Arcanist go and see if he leads you to his cohorts. So I played the good citizen. Went to work in the factory, but otherwise stayed home with Meire and the kids. It was good to have that time. After a few months, when I was sure no one was following me, I started asking around. But everyone had gotten all weird about Ramos resigning and Chrionicles taking over. So I waited for someone to get in contact with me. Once they did, well, here I am. Breaker nodded. Sensible, but also stupid. A lot has happened, and you being in the dark doesn't help. So enlighten me. Case said. What's the word? It's chaos. Reuben spoke up. We've got conflicting orders coming down from Ironsides and Chrionicles, and nobody knows just who we're supposed to be listening to. Chrionicles is calling for every cell in the city to push the guild hard, Smoky explained. More bombings, more assaults. She's trying to turn this city into a pyre, seems like. Lighting up this entire stinking city. Reuben nodded. It's been a right riot watching them scatter like ants to put out our fires. Savage grinned. You missed a lot of hot-foot jobs, Case. I almost feel bad for you. Which brings us to the new business, Smoky said. Before you joined us, Case, I was just starting to tell everyone about our new orders. These ones come from Ironsides. Rubens and Savage started muttering under their breaths. Stow it, Breaker grumbled. What is it, Smoky? She took a long breath. Ironsides says that she's working out a deal with the guild and that the last thing the union needs now is buildings bursting into fire across the city. She wants all activity put on hold until... Rubens and Savage leapt to their feet and started barking protests the moment those words left Smoky's lips. Breaker was up a moment later, jabbing a finger into Rubens' chest and shouting at him about respecting the chain of command. Smoky rubbed the bridge of her nose in frustration. She can't do that, Savage shouted. Ramos might have been able to pull that shit, but Ironsides only runs the union. Chrionicles is our boss, Rubens added. If she tells us to light the city up, I'm going to light it up. We're Arcanists first. We can't be one or the other, Breaker growled. The Arcanists only work if they've got the union to protect them. Like hell, Savage shouted. The union working alongside the same people that arrested us, that hanged our friends. But at least Ramos knew how to balance both sides. Rubens pointed out. The old man needs to get back here and sort this mess out. Do we know where he's off to? Ramos can swing for all I care, Savage said, turning on her ally. Him and Ironsides, I'm sick of sneaking about like mice. We have the guild backed into a corner. I say we move in for the kill. They collectively argued back and forth, shouting over one another so as not to hear an opposing opinion. Case closed his eyes and tried to let the noise drift to static. Every important decision always seemed to boil down to an argument. He hadn't missed it. Shut up! He shouted. Shut up! Shut up! The room fell to silence. This is getting us nowhere. Smoky sighed. We have our orders. We're not going to debate our orders like a bunch of turncoats. If Caris wants to countermand our sides, we'll let them argue over it instead of us. We just have to lay low for a while. It's nothing we haven't done 1,000 times before. Not this time, Rubens argued. We got an opening. I say we hit the guild with everything we have. This fight's always been between the Arcanists and the guild. The Union doesn't call the shots. It never did. So it's time for the Union to pick a side. Breaker glanced around the room, judging everyone else's facial expressions. We all have our reasons being here. The Arcanist, Union, they're one in the same. Union rules say that when there's a disagreement among equals, we vote. Before anyone could protest, he added, even if you've never seen the inside of a mine, it's still the Union that signs our paychecks at the end of the day. That seemed to shut Rubens up. Okay then, Smokey continued. We go around the table and vote. No secret ballots here. It's the only way to know where we all stand. I'll go first. I'm with Ironsides. I want us all to survive whatever comes our way, and that means being cautious. Breaker? Breaker gave her a supportive nod. I'm with you, Smokey. I was Union before I was Arcanist. So call me biased if you want, but this sticky business has always been in the shadows. That's where it belongs. Rubens? Rubens didn't bother to look anyone in the eye. You already know where I stand. I'm not here for a cause. I joined this fight because the guild hung my sister. End of the day, I'll follow the one handing out torches and march in toward the enclave, and right now that's Caris. Smokey frowned, but said nothing to him. Savage? Savage set her jaw. The guild are interlopers in my homeland. I stand with the Arcanists to destroy the guild. I care little for the Union and its business dealings. They are no different than She clenched her teeth. The Union cannot use the guild's methods and pretend they are any different. We must fight them in the open. All eyes turned to Case. He felt their stares boring into him, but he kept his eyes on the crack in the table. I guess you're the tiebreaker, John, Smokey said. Case nodded. He pulled out his pocket watch and flicked it open. He stared down at the picture of Meire and the kids. He closed the lid and then stood up. Some of you would have preferred if I'd stayed away, but here I am. Case stopped himself, sighed, and squeezed the pocket watch. We're all different people than when we first came together, when we had a mutual enemy. But now that Ramos has left, our common cause is gone, and our true colours are shining through. Who knows, maybe the cause is still there, but the paint's chipped and covered in mud. He paused to gather his thought. I spent the past year with my family. When we first came to Malifaux, we had nothing. I went to work in a union factory, and they gave me a decent wage, despite not having any idea what I was doing. When they approached me about joining the Arcanists, I signed up because I wanted to repay the Union for that opportunity, to thank them for protecting me and mine from the Guild. If we cast off the Union for the sake of spite in the Guild, we might as well cut off our own heads. Smokey and Breaker both nodded agreement, but Rubens finally stood up. Well, ain't that a pretty speech? He said. His voice dripped with venom. We voted, Smokey interjected. That's that, Rubens. I don't think so, Rubens said. This isn't about keeping a comfy job. This is about fighting tyranny. It's about punishing those who think they're above justice. Hear, hear, Savage said. We don't fight for your wages. We're fighting to cast down the Guild and show them that they can't just take whatever they want. Burn it to the ground, Rubens exclaimed. He smacked his fist down onto the table, causing it to jump. Smokey exhaled slowly. If that's how you want it, then I think it's time we part ways. I'm not going to disobey orders by running off into a warehouse fire. And you're just going to put the rest of us at risk if you keep trying to lash out at the Guild like a rabid dog. You go fight your little war, Breaker added. Those of us with something to lose will pick up the mess you left. His words were cut off by the sound of a distant gunshot. Rubens drew his pistol in the blink of an eye, suddenly wary. What was that? Put the gun away. Smokey's own pistol was in her hand a moment later, and as Rubens realized what was happening, he lowered his arm and pointed his own weapon back at her. Case was a heartbeat slower, drawing his own pistol and aiming it at Rubens. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye and saw Savage pointing her heavy pistol right at his head. Breaker stood off to the side, staring at them with wide eyes. "You miserable bastard," Smokey said through gritted teeth to Rubens. "What are you going to do? Shoot your own people just so you can keep burning buildings?" "I thought I heard a gunshot," Rubens replied. "Just lower your pistol. I ain't got nothing to lose, but I don't want to see it end here." Time froze for Case. Fingers tensed over triggers. The stagnant air weighed down on his shoulders. He felt the ticking pocket watch in his hand. A heavy click rang out as the hand stopped at 12, noon. A half-second later, a knock came from the door. Gunshots rang out, drowning everyone's shouts of surprise in a cacophony of explosions. Smokey immediately went down, and Rubens cried out in pain as he staggered backwards, grabbing at his shoulder. Case felt something snap and scrape against the side of his head, knocking his head back like he had been kicked in the head by a mule. And then his world went white. When Case opened his eyes, he found himself on his back, staring at the two bright and swinging electric lantern through a lens of gunsmoke. His head and ribs felt like someone had swung at him with a lead pipe, and the vision in his right eye was stained red. Blinking rapidly, he slowly sat up and saw Savage struggling against a berserk Breaker, whose screams were muffled through the ringing in his ears. Breaker grabbed hold of Savage with both arms and hurled her into the door. He went to grab her again, but she drew a second pistol hidden in her coat and fired. Breaker brought up his metal arm to protect his head and midsection from the barrage of bullets that ricocheted into the room's dirty walls. When she ran out of bullets and started clicking on empty cylinders, he reached for the weapon. But Savage tossed it aside, distracting him long enough to draw a knife from her boot and repeatedly stab him in the stomach. Breaker fell in a cloud of blood and dust, his pneumatic arm clawing at the air. Case fought against the ringing in his head, rolling onto his hands and knees as he groped about for his pistol. As soon as his fingers numbly squeezed around it, he drew it up to meet with Rubens, who was aiming back at him. The door then exploded inward, slamming against Savage and knocking her back to the ground. Out from the plumes of smoke came a trio armed with polished steel and flickering handfuls of etheric fire. Two of them were wearing the long red coats that were embroidered with the symbol of the witch hunters. The third, the one in front, was wearing tattered rags that obscured its face. Rubens fired at them the moment they emerged. The witching stalker in front fell with a reverberating groan, its stomach peppered with bullets. While collapsing to the ground, it fired 2 bullets that struck Rubens in the chest, engulfing him in green flames that spread over him like a bath. As he screamed and thrashed in a wash of fire, the female witch hunter steadily raised her pistol and fired, catching Rubens square between the eyes and blowing his brains out across the back wall. The 2 witch hunters brandished their guns around the room, preparing to retaliate against any further attacks. When none presented themselves, the witchling stalker stood up and released a low wheeze. "Clear," it hissed. The witch hunters went to check on the fallen. The woman began to kneel over Case, but he waved him off. "I'm fine, check her." Case pointed at Smokey. Her partner moved to the fallen woman and rested a finger against her neck. "She's alive." He pressed his hand to her chest, and it glowed with flickering golden light, causing Smokey to open her eyes and gasp for breath. "Easy," the mage calmly spoke. "You're all right. Under arrest, but all right. These 2 are dead." The witchling stalker wheezed as it looked up from Rubens and Breaker. The woman stood up, leaving Case as she went to check Savage, who groaned when she touched her. "This one's alive too." The witch hunter pushed the door off Savage, unhooked a control collar from her belt, and snapped it shut over the woman's neck. "You hear me?" She slapped Savage's face just hard enough to get her attention. "By the authority invested in me by the Witch Hunter Special Division of the Guild of Mercantilers, you are under arrest." No! Savage clawed at the collar around her neck. "No, you can't do this!" The witch hunter hauled her up by one arm. "Traitor!" Savage howled as the woman dragged her out of the room. "Case, you traitor! You're gonna—" Her words were cut off as the woman clubbed her with the butt of her pistol. Case stumbled to his feet, rubbing a swollen gunshot graze just above his temple. "A hair's breadth to the right and you'd be a dead man," said the male witch hunter. "Glad to see you made it out. You did good work. I want to say that we arrived just in time, but—" He gestured to the corpses around them. "You?" Smokey asked as she sat up, staring at Case. "You led them here?" Case frowned. "I didn't want to. They've got my family. If I want to keep them safe, this is the price I have to pay." He rubbed his head. "I'm sorry." Smokey shuddered, hugging her arms. She looked around at the bodies of the people she knew, and her face twisted into anger and horror. The remaining witch hunter hauled her to her feet and collared her without a word. The witchling stalker followed them out of the room, though Case wasn't sure that she wouldn't do something irrational between the bar and whatever holding cell they had prepared for her. He stared at the carnage, at people he'd known for years, for good or worse. He didn't see Arcanists or Unioners or even Guild. He just saw dead comrades, dead friends. Case choked on the words. Spit turned to ash on his tongue as he stared down at Reuben's charred corpse. It was in that moment when he realized that he couldn't feel the familiar quiet tick of his pocket watch. The weight of the watch dragged him to his knees. With hesitant fingers, John Case reached into his pocket and felt what was no longer a clasped timepiece, but shards of metal and broken gears. Carefully, he emptied his pocket into the palm of his hand and looked down at the shreds of paper that used to be the image of his wife and child. He then looked back up to the settling madness around him, as tears clouded his eyes. "My family."
That's it for another installment of the Weird Chronicles. Join us next time for more tales of action and adventure.